ish. Hello, my friends. It's another episode of the Jay Talking Show. We did one at 11. Now we have Rich Rubino back. He's here pretty much on a weekly basis now. I mean, that's not by design, it just kind of happens. And we're here to talk about exaggeration, the exaggeration of presidential candidates, and mostly. We'll probably branch out a little bit into other politicians, but political exaggeration focusing on presidents and some examples of that. First, I do have to ask you about, how are you defining exaggeration, and at what point does an exaggeration become a lie, and are you including straight up lies as exaggeration?
Well, this whole thing really started with George Santos, the congressman-elect in New York. He won relatively comfortably a swing congressional district. His predecessor in Congress, the current congressman, ran for governor, lost in a primary, and during his campaign, he basically made up that he went to college. He made up that he worked for Goldman Sachs. He somewhat made up that he had Jewish heritage, that he was Jewish, but he was actually a Catholic. So there's all this stuff that's going on, and the question is, what's going to happen to him now? I think it's almost unprecedented for a candidate to have exaggerated to this extent and to actually get elected. And I guess it shows political malpractice on the part of his opponent that none of this stuff was dug up during his respective campaign. So he landed up winning. It was actually an interesting campaign because both the Republican and the Democratic nominees were gay. The first time that both major party candidates were gay, basically in American history. And he's 34 years old. He was kind of a Trump acolyte, if you will. He used to talk about, walking by the Trump Towers and saying, "This is what I want to be someday." So he was elected. And now the question is, what can happen to him? And because of the Powell case back in 1969, Adam Clayton Powell, after some ethics violations, was reelected, and Congress wanted not to seat him. John McCormick from Massachusetts, the Speaker of the House at the time, ruled that he could not be seated. It went all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court basically ruled that there is no avenue for the United States Congress to not let somebody be seated. Theoretically, they could be expelled, which is extremely rare. It's only happened 5 times in American history that a House member has actually been expelled, and some of those were for Civil War, being seen as being a traitor during the Civil War. The most recent ones were Mike Myers, not the baseball player, not the actor, but the congressman back in 1980 for ethics violations and part of the Abscam scandal. And most recently, back in 2002, James Traficant for allegedly forcing some of his employees to work for him on his houseboat and his farm in Youngstown, Ohio. So that was kind of, or in the Ohio region rather, but so that was kind of, it's very rare, and theoretically they could go through this, they could expel him. Part of it is Kevin McCarthy needs every single vote to become speaker, and there are currently 5 anti-Kevin votes. So he really needs George Santos to vote for him to become speaker. Now, there's a possibility that theoretically he gets sworn in. The first vote he has is speaker. He votes for Kevin McCarthy. Then the Republicans could move to expel him, but that is probably not going to happen. My supposition here is that he will serve out his full term. The Republicans will essentially find benefactors for somebody to challenge him if he even runs for re-election in the primary in 2024, but they probably are stuck with him.
Hmm.
So that's what's going on contemporaneously. So it got me to think about, historically, right, have there been any circumstances similar to this? And the answer is, it's almost unprecedented that somebody not only exaggerated or fabricated, but lied to this extent. And the first thing that came to my mind was Massachusetts' own John Lakian. John Lakian, a businessman, a venture capitalist. Back in 1982, on the Democratic side, you had Mike Dukakis, who ended up beating the incumbent governor, Ed King, who had beat him in 1978. And John Lakian was the front runner for the Republican nomination that year. And then the Boston Globe found out that part of his resume had been basically fabricated. He, for example, said he took courses at Harvard. He did not. He said that his father had died in World War II. He did not. And he said, respectively, that he also said that he had won a battle promotion in Vietnam, which he had not done.
Stolen valor is bad news.
All this stuff comes out, and John Lakian originally he comes out and he denies all these accusations. So at any rate, he ends up losing the primary. He ended up suing the Boston Globe for libel. and he ended up losing. Basically, if you know about this decision, it's actual malice. And in 1967, in the New York Times versus Sullivan Supreme Court case, they ruled that you need actual malice, which is knowing falsity or reckless disregard for the truth. But if you're a public figure, that is. But basically, what the Globe had said about John Lakean was completely accurate. So he leaves politics for a while, comes back in 1993, and runs for a United States Senate seat against Mitt Romney. Mitt Romney was running, John Lakean was running, two venture capitalists, and John Lakean basically does a mea culpa, and he says, well, everybody kind of embellishes their resume. And his press secretary at the time says, well, one thing he's done is he's learned, and successful people learn, and that's how they essentially prosper. They learn from their mistakes. So he runs for Senate again, puts $3 million of his own money into that race, and lands up garnering 18% of the vote against Mitt Romney. One of his biggest mistakes, and this was, I don't know if it was a faux pas or if this was purposeful, but during one of the debates, he called Mitt Romney, who was Mormon, he referred to him as Mr. Mormy. Then he corrected himself and he said Mr. Mormon. Now, was that some sort of
Mr. Mormy?
Mormy? Then he called him Mr. Mormon. Is that somehow some way of kind of a dog whistle, if you will, that Mitt Romney is Mormon? So that was the main part of, I think, that campaign. One of the big mistakes he landed up making. He also ran, by the way, on the Army flat tax, Dick Armey at the time, congressman from Texas, the future House Majority Leader. He was a big advocate for the Army for the Army flat tax proposal, and he lands up losing miserably in that election. Goes back to venture capital, and then later in life, in 2017, he is convicted on charges of basically taking securities fraud, taking $15.6 million basically from his clients, and he spends 55 months in jail. But that was the first one, but we can go over a litany of these.
So backing up to Lakean, when his press person says, well, he's a smart person learn from their mistakes. The retort to that is, no, this is not about him being a smart person and learning from their mistakes. It's about this person having an absence of character. Yeah. Which is something that doesn't change. Your character is forged at a young age. You had the character to steal valor, to lie. That is your character. You're not going to learn a new character. That would, if I were, was that a debate, by the way, where he, when that came up, somebody would have had a chance to say what I just said in the debate forum?
No, when he was running the first time, and he was the early front runner for the Republican nomination. He was seen as somebody who was charismatic, good-looking, Vietnam veteran. All that was true, but he had fabricated certain parts of his resume. The Boston Globe reported it. So that's when that came out. And then he loses. He basically leaves politics. People think they're never going to hear from him again. Then 1994, he does a mea culpa and says, yes, I basically lied, but I've learned from my mistakes. Okay. Runs for the Senate campaign again and ends up losing.
Let's start from the most recent president. Well, the current president. Any examples of exaggeration from Joseph Biden?
Yeah, there was actually, particularly when he ran for president back in 1998. It's interesting. Actually, the reason he dropped out of that race was because John Sasso, who worked for one of his main opponents, Massachusetts Governor Mike Dukakis, found out that he had plagiarized parts of his speeches. He had been talking about his personal life and the life of his wife, and it turned out that it was almost verbatim from what Neil Kinnock, the Labour Party leader in Great Britain, had said in a speech. Then they did more research. It turned out he'd taken other lines from Robert Kennedy, from Hubert Humphrey. He ends up dropping out the race, and he says, I've done dumb things before, and I'll do dumb things again. But during that campaign, he was seen as somebody who was very young, charismatic, somebody who had been elected to the United States Senate, by the way, before he was literally the age he could actually serve. He was 29 years old. He became 30 later. But when he ran in 1988, there was one moment where a voter challenged him, and he said, I'm smarter than you are. And he talked about this award that he had won in political science when he was a student at the University of Delaware. And then it turned out he had not won that award. Then he talked about the place he had returned. He talked about where he had gone in Syracuse Law School, what rank he was. It turned out his rank was actually much lower. His rank, he did not win this award in political science. So
we're talking lots of lies, not exaggerations.
Yes,
those are straight up
yes,
black and white lies. Also, plagiarism, you might say, well, that's not a lie. That's plagiarism. But
Well,
really,
yeah.
what it is a lie of omission, because you're saying to people that I made this up when somebody else made it up, which is a lie. Okay. How about, let's see, who preceded him? President Trump. Did he exaggerate at all?
No. No. Yeah, he's the exception to the rule. No,
So what did he? What are some glaring exaggerations from him? I know the it is thought that there was exaggeration on his inauguration crowd. What's the fact on that?
yeah, well, according to the National Park Service, it was a lot less than Donald Trump actually said that it was. That first day after his inauguration, his press secretary goes up and immediately starts talking about the crowds and doesn't take questions and says that there were a lot more people that were on the Washington Mall that year watching than the media was essentially reporting. That was part of Trump's strategy in his 2020 presidential campaign. And if you're running in a Republican primary, there are probably three things. Probably, I think there's a trifecta of essentially assemblages you can go after that are going to get you extreme applause in a Republican primary. The first is Hollywood. The second is academicians, specifically if you can go after Ivy League schools, if you can go after Harvard, Yale, Princeton, you're in very good stead in the Republican Party. And of course, the elite media. You see Governor Santos doing this right now, but Donald Trump would always talk about how the media was essentially out to get them. And this is not, by the way, a strategy unique or sui generis to Donald Trump. Bill Clinton did it in the 1992 Democratic primary, saying that they were basically the media was more favorable to Paul Tsongas. I mean, you can go back. Richard Nixon said the same thing about John F. Kennedy. Franklin Roosevelt, as a Democrat, said that they were more favorable to the Republican Party, to Herbert Hoover. But that was one of the things Donald Trump did. And he also talked about how he went to the Wharton School,
Yeah.
which is true. But most people, when they think of the Wharton School, they think of he would have gotten an MBA there, but he actually got an undergraduate degree. So that's something that's kind of true, but there's kind of a lie by omission because there's kind of more to the story, if you will.
Back to that inauguration crowd thing. To me,
Yeah.
that just seemed really baby-like. I had more people than he did. It's like, really? You're going to spend your time being a baby like that? I thought that's childlike. No,
Well,
is that an
yeah.
effective? Is that something important to say? I had a bigger crowd than he did. Is that like?
Well, that's Trump's modus operandi. The story is when he met Obama after winning the 2020 presidential election, Obama was there and his photographer was there. And the first thing he did, he went over to Obama, introduced him to the photographer, and Trump supposedly said, "Oh, I've heard of you because you're famous." So that's something obviously Donald Trump values. Then he went to Obama and talked about how great both of their crowds were, and was talking about how better they had how they had better crowds than other candidates like Hillary and Ted Cruz, for example. So that's really how Donald Trump, I think, judges. Kind of that's where his MO is what the crowd is, how
Okay.
many people showed up. If you look at it, by the way, Louis Farrakhan, remember the Million Man March?
Yeah.
He was always saying that the National Park Service undercounted the people, and there were a lot more people there for that. So he's not the first person to do that.
Okay. Okay? So we're at Trump now. What are, like, I don't know, three of his biggest exaggerations?
Oh, I think certainly he would say he often says sometimes that he's more popular than he actually is. He sometimes, by the way, what he says will be true. For example, he talked recently when Ron DeSantis was reelected. He said, "Well, I did, look where I did in the Republican primary, in the Florida primary. I did better than Ron DeSantis." Or he talked about Governor Youngins in Virginia, and he immediately says, "Well, he won because of me." But actually, the governor tried to kind of distance himself from Donald Trump, respectively, and he basically tried to run on Donald Trump's policies and issue positions without specifically running as a Donald Trump Republican. Now, some politicians say, some of what he says is that politicians have come to him basically grappling for money in the past. He talks about Mitt Romney. He's talked about Nancy Pelosi about doing that. He's talked about Joe Biden for doing that. He's interesting. And also, part of it is his misrepresenting, I think, himself as a Republican. If you ever hear one of the expression you often uses is Republican in name only to
Yeah.
criticize people that he does not think are part of the Republican Party.
Right.
But he himself, if you go back in history, he was somebody who part of this was transactional. He's living in New York. You give money to somebody like Chuck Schumer, your senator from New York. You expect something to come back from it. You give something to Nancy Pelosi, she's Speaker of the House. You want something to come back from that, and that's what politics has been like since time immemorial, since the Articles of Confederation. But what Trump did back in 2000, for example, he was thinking of running as the Reform Party's nominee. He was somebody who talked about how the Republican Party had gone way too far to the right. He said Pat Buchanan, who eventually garnered the nomination that year, was a Adolf Hitler lover. He talked about Mitt Romney in 2012 not being too hard, essentially, on immigration, for example. So he's really kind of reinvented himself, and it's fascinating when he reinvents himself. He then goes after those who are actual Republicans, who have been Republicans their whole lives or had an ideology that was that of a Republican Party before Donald Trump changed the positioning on trade, on foreign intervention, and on immigration. He really changed the trajectory. I'm not saying it's right or wrong. I'm just saying he changed the trajectory of the Republican Party. But now we're at a point where anybody who does not support him is essentially seen as a rhino. And you saw this in previous elections where, for example, right here in Massachusetts, Jeff Deal won the Republican nomination. And part of that was because he was seen as a Donald Trump Republican. The problem was he wins the nomination, and there weren't enough Donald Trump Republicans to win. So, as you might expect, he ends up losing by over 30 points because it's Massachusetts, and Massachusetts has about 11% Republican Party registration, with maybe 30% or so that are conservative-leaning unenrolled.
So Trump was pro-abortion for a while, right?
He supported abortion rights. That's correct. He later changed his position on that. He actually said that essentially that he was against, for example, there was a proposal to ban late-term abortions. He was essentially against that. He was also somebody who was very sympathetic to Hillary Clinton. She talked about what a great senator she was. Somebody who was very much for Bill Clinton during the Monica Lewinsky hearings, talking about that Bill Clinton used to say was a very good president. So he really changed kind of his trajectory.
Right.
And
so he's really a fake conservative.
That depends on what you mean. To paraphrase from Bill Clinton, that depends what the meaning of the word conservative is.
well, I mean, it's not part of his constitution. He decided, I'm going to say this stuff because he determined there was a need to say this stuff because there was an opening in that area.
He changed. Yeah. He saw an aperture in the Republican Party. I think part of that was Roger Stone. Part of that was his advisors.
It must say it worked for him. He does have an astounding ability to generate loyalty from people that he's acting against the best interests of. A lot of people are harmed by his policies, but they still embrace him.
Well, the one thing that Trump has been consistent on, if you go back to the 1980s, he was interviewed by Oprah Winfrey in 1989, protective tariffs. That's the one thing that he's always talked about. That's his populism right there, okay? He's always talked about tariffs. He said, we're losing our lunch to Japan, for example. And he goes back to the 90s. That's the one thing he's consistent on. So basically what they found, I think Donald Trump's advisors back in 2015 when they were planning the campaign, is you need to basically counter program what the other Republicans are running on. The other Republicans are running as traditional kind of less government, socially conservative, and basically foreign interventionist Republicans. He runs on a different track. His track, they take the trade issue, and he's been very consistent on that. And he says NAFTA was an awful agreement. Bill Clinton signed it. Republicans worked on it. NAFTA was awful. We need to repeal NAFTA. Then he talks about foreign intervention and specifically the Iraq War. And he says Iraq War, basically 1 million people are dead because of the Iraq War. And there was no weapons of mass destruction. It was one of the worst foreign policy disasters in American history. He says in a Republican primary. Ron Paul said the same thing basically in 2008. And he basically, it was one debate, and he went after him. And and he was also talking about why we were attacked. And he said, we're over here because we're over there because we were intervening in all these places. That's why we had troops in Saudi Arabia, sanctions in Iraq, because of our views on Israel and Palestine, because of all the autocratic regimes we support. The next day, the chairman of the Michigan Republican Party says Ron Paul should not be allowed in any of the debates.
because of
Donald
that. Whereas that was a
This
plus.
was
It became a plus for Trump, where it was a crusher for Paul.
Yes, absolutely. Now,
Mm-hmm.
for Paul, actually, the next day it raised a load of money for him because there
Mm-hmm.
were a lot of people who aren't necessarily Republicans, including young people who disagree with him just about anyone else, who said, that's exactly it. Our interventions overseas are what's causing all these September 11th, causing all this. We need to essentially come home, America, as George McGovern used to acerbate. So Ron Paul got some money, but obviously most
Mm-hmm.
traditional conservatives, that was not the position.
That makes
Donald
sense.
Trump changed the trajectory. The only person who really ran on that platform, if you include the immigration, Pat Buchanan in 1992 and 1996, very similar. And at the time, many in the conservative movement were saying, well, Pat Buchanan's really a liberal. He's a Noam Chomskyite, everything else. Donald Trump was able to do that. And here's where else he succeeded. Other Republicans, for talking about fiscal austerity, some are talking about potentially privatizing Social Security, for example, Medicare, Social Security. These were programs that many of Trump's respective constituents, those who are gravitated toward him, were dependent on.
Mm.
He's the only candidate who says, no, we need to actually put more money into these entitlement programs.
Okay, wow. So there's three things: foreign intervention,
Yep.
trade, and entitlements.
immigration.
I'm glad with and immigration. I'm glad we are talking about this, because now it all starts to make sense. And I'm glad you're getting to the immigration thing. Can you address that? And then can we go back and have you give me, for everybody, the like three pros and cons for NAFTA?
Yep. I'll talk
Okay.
about
Immigration first.
yeah. This is basically where, when he ran in 2000, when he was thinking about running for the Reform Party nomination, part of the reason he dropped out was he said, well, Pat Buchanan was going to win this nomination. He's too extreme on immigration. But what Pat Buchanan proposed and what Donald Trump proposed, first of all, you build a wall and you curtail illegal immigration. But also, and this is what Pat Buchanan's been saying, you need to curtail legal immigration. In other words, essentially, you need to almost have, Pat Buchanan would talk about a moratorium, essentially say we have enough people right now. We should not allow any more in, except for potentially those seeking asylum or certain refugees from Cuba, that type of thing. But Donald Trump basically, this is a very populist line, because many traditional conservatives, they're against illegal immigration. But when it comes to legal immigration, they
Right.
said we absolutely need that. And
Right.
some even say that we need a path to citizenship for illegal immigrants. George W. Bush wanted a path to citizenship. He used to say that family values does not stop at the Rio Grande. That's was George W. Bush talking back in 2000. And at the time, he actually proposed, during his second term, he actually proposed a pathway to earn legalization. That was George W. Bush, and most of the establishment Republicans, the Wall Street Country Club Republicans, if you will, supported that. They say we need more labor in this country. Donald Trump, essentially, his appeal was not to traditional wealthy Republicans. His was to blue collar conservatives, many of whom are also fiscally relatively populist or liberal. Now, the other issue that he brought, the other issue where I think, and obviously he transmogrified on this, was abortion. When George W. Bush ran, when other Republicans ran, the question was, would you make it a litmus test that whoever you nominate to the United States Supreme Court is opposed to is somebody who would overturn Roe v. Wade? George W. Bush said no, it would not be a litmus test, but I'm personally against abortion. Donald Trump said essentially, yes, I would. So it became almost a Faustian bargain, if you will. Many conservatives, evangelicals, who probably didn't like him as a person, probably thought of this guy as a Yankee liberal, all of a sudden say this guy actually has our back. This guy is actually going to perform. So they gravitational pull toward Trump.
Mm-hmm.
Now, at first, they weren't for him. Many were for Ted Cruz. Some were for Ben Carson. Some were for Rand Paul. So Donald Trump wins the nomination, and some people are still thinking, well, he's really this Yankee, he's a liberal, everything else. But Donald Trump gets in. He nominates Supreme Court justices and lower level justices that have a history of opposing Roe v. Wade. And now Donald Trump has become a tribune of evangelical conservatives,
Mm-hmm.
some of whom in the South, despite his personal failings, they say this guy is really somebody who is really backing our agenda.
Mm-hmm. So there are four things. I start to get it now, Can you go back to NAFTA and give me just a couple pros and cons?
I think the pro, obviously, people in Texas specifically, that's why folks like then Texas Governor George W. Bush supported it, is it allows for essentially it would allow for products to be to go back and forth, and there were either very limited or Lilliputian or no tariffs whatsoever to go back and forth between the United States and Mexico. And that, of course, if you're not charging a tariff, then the consumer lands up benefiting from that because they're not paying the tariff. So as a result, products are going down. I mean, the prices of the products that are coming in are going down. That's the main. That's kind of the crux of the support of it.
So,
also, yeah,
lots of stuff cheap.
lots of stuff cheap. Absolutely.
Okay. The downside, a couple of the downsides are wages go down, correct?
Yes.
Jobs go away, wages go down, and I think a big one is if they're making stuff elsewhere where it's cheap, so that it can go back and forth and we can get it cheap. Problem is, when push comes to shove, like say China made all the chips. If China wants to shut down the chips, then we are vulnerable. I'd rather make some key components of stuff we need here. So well, I feel like I am anti-NAFTA, to tell you the truth.
I will say that there are, as much as there are jobs that go down, there are also jobs that come here as well from other companies. It's probably a trade-off, and if you look at it like everything else in the human race, there's probably nuances there, and there are people who benefit and people who do not benefit. I think probably the biggest drawback to NAFTA, and this is part of the reason Donald Trump won. This is why NAFTA is a 4-letter word in steel plate in parts of steel country, the Rust Belt, for example. Obviously, if the steel worker in Ohio is competing with someone in Mexico that's going to work for a lot less, lots of these companies will bring their jobs and say, well, let's do it in Mexico because essentially the wages are a lot lower. So as a result, you have a lot of these steel communities and some of these communities, some of these labor, traditionally Democratic communities. All of a sudden, there is no more kind of these former company towns. There are very few jobs. For example, Erie County, Pennsylvania, always traditionally Union, traditionally Democrat. Donald Trump flipped Erie County, Pennsylvania in 2016 when he flipped the state of Pennsylvania. In part, unlike every Republican presidential nominee from Eisenhower to Romney, every solitary one, Trump was not a traditional exponent of free trade. And he went in there and said, I'm going to get rid of NAFTA. So as a result, a lot of these people said, this guy, even though, he's a blue collar billionaire in many respects, West Virginia, Bill Clinton won West Virginia in 1996 by 16 points running for re-election. It was a non-contested state. 2016, Donald Trump goes to West Virginia and says, basically, this state's been decimated in part by trade, obviously automation, and there are plenty of other things as well. West Virginia is his best state that year. Wow. 2020, behind Wyoming, the ruby red state of Wyoming, West Virginia is his second best state that year.
It would seem as though if you're a Democrat and you want to win, you want to become president, you could take some of the same positions Trump did and not betray your democratic values. For example, non-intervention, you could do that. Why couldn't you be anti-NAFTA and a Democrat? You could.
Most of them are. Most Democrats are.
So there's two. As far as immigration goes, I believe you need come up with a plan that works and enforce it strictly. That's what people want to see, a plan you agree on and enforce it strictly. Yeah. Now it's just a big muddle. So you could cobble together a plan that seemed like there was some discipline. And even though you maybe allow people in who have skills for work, or you determine how many skilled immigrants we need for business and how many others you let in, and then strictly maintain that. And what was the other of the four things that worked for Trump?
I would say social issues as well, abortion being one of them.
All right. So I would think that Democrats would take a look at what worked for Trump and adopt as many of those things as you could and still maintain your blue bona fides.
Well, I think most Democrats on trade, and this is where Bill Clinton was really recreant or just, went against the grain in the Democratic Party. They were against NAFTA. If you look at it in 1993, Dick Gephardt, the House Majority Leader, and David Bonnier, the House Majority Whip, were both against NAFTA. As a matter of fact, the whip's job in the party is essentially to whip up votes for their party, for their president. David Bonnier couldn't do that because he was leading the opposition, so Bill Clinton had to get Bill Richardson, a deputy whip, to actually be his advocate to get NAFTA through. He got it through in part with the Republican leadership, Bob Dole, Newt Gingrich, Bob Michel. So it was more Republicans that voted for it than Democrats. 1996 comes along, and Pat Buchanan runs as the populist candidate and basically co-ops the NAFTA issue and says essentially that he agrees with the left on NAFTA. There's a right and the left, by the way. Jesse Helms, for example, very much anti-NAFTA. There are some real free market conservatives that are against NAFTA for the reason that they don't think there should be any managed trade. They say essentially we should just eliminate all tariffs in the first place. Why manage it? Why make deals? So that's kind of the Ron Paul position, if you will. But Pat Buchanan's position essentially lost out in that 1996, and kind of the Bob Dole, Steve Forbes was running that year, Phil Gramm, were very much all free traders. There are others who are saying we should never sell our sovereignty, for example, when it came to the World Trade Organization, joining it and letting China in. Folks like Alan Keyes, for example, who is very much a nationalist, were very much opposed to joining the World Trade Organization, for example, just like some would be opposed to being a member of, really going back to the League of Nations, but also the United Nations, for example, or any form of IMF, any form, if you will, of a international organization.
Have you ever considered working for campaigns? Because your knowledge of history and what worked and what didn't would be invaluable to a campaign. Is that something you thought about doing? You're still young enough to change careers.
Perhaps.
Why don't you do that?
I like being a non-ideological analyst right now.
How do you like that?
Yes.
You don't want to. What if some campaign did come calling and said, we need your historical perspective. Will you consult for us? Would you do that?
Perhaps.
But you don't want to get embroiled in the conflict, right?
Yeah, I'm probably a little too crooked.
Crooked? Well, you can be an advisor and be very crooked. Roger Stone.
Roger. Lee Atwater.
Okay.
You know why I say Lee Atwater? This is why Lee Atwater was a genius. Remember Lee Atwater?
Did the guy that played the saxophone?
That was him, yes.
Okay.
He would say, when he was thinking about 1992, I know we're going a little bit off the rails here, but in 1992, when he was thinking about it, he said, George H.W. Bush can win. He essentially, if they nominate Mike Dukakis, Bill Bradley, Mario Cuomo, any sort of a northern liberal, that's easy. We can beat him. The problem we're going to have is if you have a southern moderate, and the worst of them would be Bill Clinton. So this is what he does. He's saying, who can we get as an opponent? And he's trying to beat him in 1990, not 1992, when Bill Clinton would run for re-election as governor, or at least weaken him to the point that he can't run for president. So he gets this guy named Tommy Robinson, who's a Democratic member of Congress. And he says, we want you to run against Bill Clinton. In order to do that, you have to become a Republican. So they convince him to become Republican. George H.W. Bush holds a press conference and announces that Tommy Robinson has left the Democratic Party. Relatively backbencher member of Congress. And they basically say, you hear this all the time when somebody leaves their party. I have not left my party has left me. You always hear this. So Robinson basically says that, and he's going to run for governor in 1990. And that's basically the plan. And at the time, Lee Atwater was saying we need to essentially throw everything we can at Bill Clinton. The problem was Tommy Robinson couldn't get through the primary. And Sheffield Nelson, also a former Democrat, who had actually supported Ted Kennedy in 1980, lands up winning the nomination. But Lee Atwater saw Bill Clinton as the major threat. And of course, Bill Clinton, with the time, he was seen as a secondary or tertiary candidate, if you will. He was not seen as the major candidate. People, when they looked at this, even in the South, and they were looking who were the best candidates from the South, they were thinking, well, Lloyd Bentsen, Sam Nunn, Al Gore. Maybe Bob Graham, maybe Lawton Chiles will run. But Bill Clinton was seen as somebody who, well, maybe he could be a vice presidential candidate or a cabinet member, but he's probably not up to being a presidential timber at this level. But he saw that, and in 1992, sure enough, Bill Clinton lands up running and lands up winning. But he saw this going back to 1989. He saw that threat.
It kind of barely related. Why couldn't Charlie Baker run as a Democrat? Because a Massachusetts Republican, it's kind of a
Yeah.
national mainstream Democrat.
You could, yeah, you really, it's almost, first of all, because he was a Republican, because he worked for Harvard, Pilgrim Health, rather. He worked for, I mean, he worked in the healthcare industry as part of it. The fact that he worked for Republican administrations, he's going back to working for John Connally back in 1980. The fact that as governor, for example, he has some issues. For example, one thing is he always made sure Massachusetts would not be a sanctuary state. There were certain places that became sanctuary cities. He was
Is
against.
that a non-starter for any Democratic
No,
candidate?
no, it would be
So
it would be something that Democratic establishment would very much frown upon.
yeah, but he could win. He was super popular. He's got a track record. Massachusetts loved him. So
It's different.
how right can you be?
It's different, yeah, and it's different in Massachusetts. Winning in Massachusetts, if you run as a Republican, it's pretty easy to win because all you have to say is, I'm going to be a check on the other party. The other party has super majorities anyway, so I can't really do that much. And I'm going to try to work with them. And that's true. He has worked very much with the Democratic legislature. Even though they had super majorities, he vetoes legislation. He's also somebody who, for example, is against late term abortion. Some on the left say that you have to essentially be an unreserved supporter of abortion rights. He is somebody who is not that. He's somebody who, at least in the past, and this is something he can say he's changed on, but when he first ran for governor, 2010, he kind of questioned the climate change consensus. He said at the time he was trying to run as somewhat of a conservative. He said, yeah, read my lips, no new taxes. So there are things that he would not win a Democratic primary, just like Pete Buttigieg, for example.
Except he might not win. Except what if there's no one else?
Oh, if it's not Joe Biden, there's a litany of other people. I think there's a better chance. I think Governor Cooper of North Carolina
All right.
is somebody you immediately look at. Governor Murphy of New Jersey, someone you look at. Jerry Paulis of Colorado is someone you look at.
All right.
You know, there's a history of people that have changed parties trying to run for president.
I guess I'm not going to be able to shoehorn Charlie Baker in there. I'm doing my best, but
Well,
I guess I should give that.
John Connally, who I just talked about, this is interesting comparison here, myriad similitudes here. When John Connally, who was a former Democrat, became a Republican and was Treasury Secretary, Richard Nixon, when Spiro Agnew resigned, pleaded nolo contendere to tax evasion, one charge of it. He wanted John Connally as his vice presidential running mate. So he went and at the time, you go to the Congress, and the Democrats said, no, he's a turncoat. He used to be one of us. He goes to Republicans. They say Republicans. No, he was really a Democrat. Then he runs for president in 1980, and Ronald Reagan beats him. And basically, part of the reason he beats him was people thought, well, this guy's really a Democrat anyway. So it's very hard, kind of, when you switch party at some point in your life. But then again, there are some that have succeeded, and Phil Gramm is one example. He voted for the Reagan tax cut. Tip O'Neill punished him. He resigned his seat. He ran a special election, won, and then landed. The people of Texas later kind of accepted him. Richard Shelby, the day after the 1994 defeat in the midterm elections, Democrats lost 8 seats in the Senate, 52 in the House in 1994. Next day, he becomes a Democrat. He becomes a Republican in Alabama, continuously gets reelected, and now he's retiring this year at 82 years old. But generally speaking, I think Baker is somebody the Republicans and the Democrats would not accept nationally.
Okay, here's a question for people who love Baker.
Yes.
Which of the possible real contenders is most like Baker?
Well, are you assuming that Joe Biden runs for re-election?
No, I don't think I am.
Okay.
I'm not. I don't know if he's got the gumption for it.
On the Republican side, Larry Hogan.
Larry Hogan?
Yes. The outgoing governor of Maryland. It's interesting. Okay. The three most popular governors in the country are Larry Hogan, Charlie Baker, and Phil Scott from Vermont. They are the three Republican governors in the 3 states that went for the Democratic presidential nominee that had its best showing last time around: Vermont, Massachusetts, and Maryland. They all have Republican governors, the 3 most popular. Very interesting. And they all have majorities in both houses of representatives of the other parties. They have to deal with Democrats. Larry Hogan is very much running as a Charlie Baker type of a Republican, anti-Trump Republican, supporter of abortion rights, supporter of some forms of gun control. somebody who's worked with Democrats. Obviously, you have to in a demonstrably Democratic state like the state of Maryland. He is the closest to Charlie Baker, and my guess is, and I guess, well, Charlie Baker actually last time around he endorsed Governor Christie for president, in part because Christie was chairman of the Republican Governors Association, and when he was chairman of the Republican Governors Association, he supported Charlie Baker, so there was a little bit of give and take there. But Charlie Crist just lost, but Chris Christie is probably someone that's also somewhat similar, not so much in temperament, but in ideology to Charlie Baker.
Well, this just in, Bradley J. endorses Larry Hogan for president, as you can see scrolling across the thing here.
Wow.
There it is.
Wow.
It's an early endorsement for Larry Hogan.
An early endorsement, one of the first endorsements for Larry Hogan. I am seeing this right now.
It's breaking news.
You need to send this to him.
Okay. Very good. Am I the first endorser?
Semi-celebrity
endorser?
It's not officially declared, but I think all the signs are pointing that he will declare.
Good. Well, Larry, if you win, I need to have dinner in the White House. How's that?
Well, it's funny you say that. When Fred Harris used to ran for president, he would stay in a Winnebago and he'd go all around the country and he'd meet with people. Sometimes people would let him come into their house and he'd sleep over. And he promised that everybody that he did that to, he would essentially let come in and stay at the White House for one night when he actually became president. He never actually did become president, but he did very well in Iowa. He comes in 4th place. And the old expression used to be that Iowa was winnowed out people, meaning essentially if you do not do well in Iowa, you're no longer a serious candidate. He said, Iowa winnowed in me because I wasn't expected to do 4th place. I ended up doing 4th place.
This has been great. We started out doing one thing and it evolved to another thing, and that's what makes things interesting.
I love that.
I listen, I respond, and I learn as a result. I learned a lot today. I learned 4 solid reasons why Trump does well. And I learned that, then I figured out the Democratic candidate really should be careful to take a look at what you could do with those solid things. There's some of those positions work for both sides, and I learned a little bit why people are willing to forgive Trump's personal failings.
Yep.
Because he's going to do their bidding in several important areas. I don't know if that would extend to an attempt to overthrow the United States government. I think that's kind of a deal breaker. That should be a deal breaker for everybody, if you believe that's what happened. But there are probably other Republican candidates, other conservative candidates that would fill the bill. So I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah, there are going to be a litany of them, and I know there's going to be this media master narrative that this is going to be Trump versus Ron DeSantis, but this is very early in the process, and there's going to be a lot more candidates. Going to be a bevy of more candidates. There's going to be a surfeit of more candidates, a litany of more candidates. So don't think that this is just a DeSantis versus Trump race.
Very good, and I appreciate it as always. Hopefully, we can do something next week. We'll start with some topic, and it may not end up there. Maybe like today. Thank you very much. Rich Rubino has a number of books out there. You need to go to Amazon to check out the books. The most recent is The Great American Political Trivia Challenge. Did I get it right?
You got it. Political trivia on steroids.
Okay. But when you go there, you'll see the other books. And also, Rich is available to address your organization, perhaps. How do they get in touch with you if they want to do that?
Yep. Just go to, just find me on Facebook, Rich Rubino, Rubino, or go to Instagram, Rich Rubino, MHD, or Twitter, Rich Rubino, POL, but probably the best way, Facebook, just find me, Rich Rubino.
You're a genius, and I really appreciate your time.
Thank you so much. Greatly enjoyed it, Bradley.
Talk to you next time.
Will do.
Okay.